This is my legacy. As we begin Black History Month, today's bonus drop invites us to look honestly at where we've been and where we're being called to go. Groundbreaking civil rights attorney and founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, Bryan Stevenson, is joined by Anthony Ray Hinton, who was wrongfully convicted and spent 28 years on death row. Together, they reflect on the moral failures of our justice system today and what it costs when society looks away. This is a conversation about dignity, courage, and hope carried forward across generations. Let's jump in.
After representing over 140 people on death row, what have they taught you about what's possible when we see people's full humanity? Do we as a society, Bryan, do we really have the capacity to create a system that certainly has far less flaws?
Yeah.
'Cause it's deeply flawed.
Yes. I don't think we'll ever have the capacity to get to a place where we should be trying to kill people. I don't think that's something we can do. And I think, to be honest, Mark, I think if we made the investment into helping the poor and provided people with the legal help they needed, if we confronted this history of racial bias and discrimination and overcame the presumption of dangerousness and guilt, if we made the commitment to health care for the millions of people who are traumatized by violence, that are struggling and dealing with all of these challenges, if we made the commitment to creating opportunities for the people who are marginalized and vulnerable and disfavored and treated so bad, if we did all of those things, I then think we would not want the death penalty. We would know that that's not something that is effective in responding to this. And I just think basically, we don't really want to be a cruel society. We don't really want to be a cruel nation. But more broadly, we absolutely could do so much better with our criminal legal system.
I'm sitting here thinking, when I was arrested, the officer told me there was 5 things that was going to convict me. And he said, number 1, you Black. Number 2, a white man is going to say you shot her. Number 3, you're going to have a white judge. Number 4, you're going to have a white prosecutor. And number 5, you're going to have an all-white jury. Nowhere in there did he ever say, we have evidence, we have fingerprints, we have an eyewitness, we got you on camera, or we got someone that gave us a description. And even to this day, that still haunts me, because this detective knew they didn't need no evidence. They had the only evidence they need, and that is that I was Black. And until we get above skin color, we will never be able to have a system as you just asked. And that's my honest opinion.
You grew up in Alabama, and when you think about the story that you just shared, and after 30 years of being incarcerated wrongly, have you seen any progress in our country?
I would say yes, I've seen some progress, but we haven't progressed as much as I had thought would be after spending 30 years in a cage. If I'm being honest with you, I think America is more racist now than it was in the 60s. It just done more somewhat undercover. And so you have to be somewhat on the lookout for it. I understand when I go in a store, I'm being watched. I can have on, as they say, a Calvin Klein suit. I can have on a nice tie. My shoes could be shiny. But I'm still looked on as though I'm there to rob someone. And it's the way you go to a restaurant. I notice they seat us in a certain place. I'm looking for all of these things because I'm really trying to see how far have we come. And I still believe that we made progress, but in the same token, we lost a lot of progress as well. And so if I had to sit here this morning and say, are we better? I've said this before. I definitely believe that we are somewhat better, because that was the time in the state of Alabama when those detectives came to get me. They probably would have hung me in the middle of the tree in the backyard, or they could have killed me. So at least I got to jail. And that tells me that we made some progress.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's also interesting. That question's a really powerful question. When I think about the legal system, so in Just Mercy, I wrote about Walter McMillan, a bunch of other people, and it was actually easier in the early 90s to prove someone's innocence and win their relief because the court was so unprepared for that. The culture and the society was so unprepared for that. When you had overwhelming evidence of innocence, people were like, oh my God, we got to do something. And, he spent 6 years on death row. By the time I met Mr. Hinton at the end of the 90s, things had started to shift. And all of a sudden, people were getting used to innocent people being on death row. I remember calling media and people would say things like, well, is there something extra? We've done the Innocence story before. That's not new news any longer. And they just weren't interested. And the courts got acculturated to the fact that there are innocent people on death row. And that added to the chat. We presented the evidence within a year after we started working on the case. And the court should have said in 2000, oh my God, this is a mistake. We're going to let you. But instead, they didn't. And we had to fight and fight and fight. And we had to go all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. I went to the Attorney General. We went to the prosecutor, said, look at this evidence. And they was like, no. And actually, since he's been released in 2015, I'm going to suggest it's even harder now than it was in 2015. The court we had in 2015, we don't have today. We got a unanimous ruling, which gives me a lot of hope. But there are people who are innocent and wrongly convicted on death row right now who are not going to have the same opportunity for release because we've just turned our back. Our courts today are operating in a way where they're much less concerned about the plight of innocent people on death row. They're much less concerned about the plight of the poor, people who have been victimized, people who have been exploited because of their disabilities. And so in that regard, I actually think we are in a worse position than we were 20, 25 years ago, at least on these legal questions. And I feel like we've made a lot of progress when we're sitting in this office when I first met, right, we didn't have a room like was to sit at the EJI,
It's a nicely appointed room, may I
well,
add.
thank you. And we created these sites, which I'm really proud of. So there's a lot of progress, but we started doing our narrative work because I'm a product of Brown versus Board of Education. I grew up in a community where Black children couldn't go to the public schools. County was 80% white, 20% Black. If you had a vote, they would have never voted to end racial segregation. It took lawyers coming in to impose the rule of law to force those school doors open. And I began to worry about 12 years ago that we might not be able to win Brown versus Board of Education. And today, I'm pretty persuaded that we could not win Brown versus Board of Education. I don't think our court today would do something that disruptive on behalf of disfavored people as the court did in 1955. And that means we have absolutely not made the kind of progress that we need to make. We're in a worse place, which means that we're going to have to engage even more to create the kind of hopeful, healthy future that I believe all of us want to see.
Is that the individual system of judges, or is that the institution? Is the institution the problem, or is it the individuals?
It's a great question. I think it's a combination of both. So, for example, in the state courts, places like Alabama and Georgia, et cetera, our judges are elected. And there was a time when if you were a good judge and you were doing good work in enforcing the rule of law, no one would even run against you because it was supposed to be apolitical. That's changed over the last 30 years. And now we have judges who are politicians. And they're engaging in the same politics of fear and anger that our elected officials in other areas are. So they're saying, I'm for the death penalty. I'm for this. I'm going to do away with that. I'm not going to let people out of jails and prisons on technicalities. And those individuals have now taken on the role of judges, and they're not operating as judges. They're operating as ideologues, which means that they don't want to be associated with releasing somebody from death row, even if the evidence is of innocence. So in that sense, it is the individuals. But in another sense, it's also the institutions. Because even in our federal courts, where people have life tenure, we've lowered the bar. we now insist on a kind of ideological affiliation when we appoint judges, and these institutions have tolerated that. I mean, you'll recall that when when Justice Scalia died, President Obama should have appointed his replacement, and the institution of the United States Senate said, no, we're not going to play by the rules any longer. We're not going to allow any candidate to move forward. And now you're seeing institutions basically turning their back on the rule of law, the obligations that courts must meet. And so in that sense, it's also institutional. And so I think we have to change both. I don't need a judge who believes everything I believe. I don't need them to share my politics, but I do need them to commit to the rule of law. If the law says you cannot torture, we don't allow torture. If the law says you cannot convict someone who's not guilty, we don't convict innocent people. If the law says you can't engage in racial bias in jury selection, we don't tolerate that. And we can have different political perspectives, but that has to be your role. Otherwise, I say, don't be a judge. Be a different kind of politician. And so it is creating a crisis. And I think that's a really important question mark, because I think we're really in a moment of true institutional crisis. Because once you lose the integrity and the reliability and the credibility of the legal system, we're vulnerable to all kinds of excess. When you study what happened in Nazi Germany in the 1930s, you had these politicians, Hitler and these others, but you also had a legal system that could have kept them in check. But when the legal system collapsed, there was no check. I'm very worried about the moment we are in. And, at least for me, I say to judges, and Mr. Hinton and I have both spoken to judges and lawyers. I said, ultimately, you're going to be judged by what you do and what you don't do. This moment that we are in is not going to be the final story. In 30 years, people are going to be talking about what was happening in 2025. And I get frustrated because, people say, if I had been alive during the time of slavery, I would have been an abolitionist. Nobody says, oh, I would have been an enslaver. They also, I would have been an abolitionist. Everybody says, if I'd been alive at the beginning of the 20th century, I've been fighting against lynchings. Martin, everybody says, if I'd been there in Selma in 1965, I've been marching with Dr. King. I would have participated in the boycott. But I don't think you get to say that if in 2025 you are tolerating the abuse of law, the violation of the law. You're not doing what's right. You're doing what's politically favored. If you don't do what's right now, you can't claim to have been on the right side of right in all those other periods of time. And that's going to be the test our judges and our institutions are going to have to pass in the year that comes, and this critical time period that we're in right now.
One of the things that we say is that, for those who said that they would have marched with Dr. King, we say, are you marching now?
That's right.
And I think it's important to underscore what you said about the safeguards, because we also talk about in our house that the judicial system, we went during the civil rights movement, we went to the judicial system for relief. Yeah. And if that had not been in place, we would not have seen the victories that we saw. And that is what's so scary about what's going on now. We talk about the fact that our daughter, Martin Luther King's granddaughter, has fewer rights now at 17 than the day she was born. Her generation has progressively lost rights, and that has not happened since the end of Reconstruction and the beginning of the passage of Black codes. But I will also say that for me, I have a lot of hope because of this generation. I mean, these kids are truly, truly extraordinary. And I think that they're more resolute. After the election, the hardest call that I had to make, we were in Washington, was to our daughter. No matter what side or who you voted for, just the fact that you kind of had a sense that America was not ready for a Black woman. And to have to apologize to her, to say, and to all Black women, Black girls, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that this is still, happening. But she and her generation, she was more resolute than ever the morning after. And so I do have a lot of hope in this generation. I really think we're going to see truly one of the greatest generations that this country has seen.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, because I do think that's what we have been taught. I mean, I feel like, I mean, I live now in Montgomery, Alabama. I walk these streets where a generation ago, people would put on their Sunday best and they'd go places to push for the right to vote. They'd go places to push to be respected. And oftentimes, while they were on their knees praying, they'd get battered and bloodied and beaten. And they would go home and wipe the blood off and change the clothes, and they'd go back and do it again. And they didn't know what the outcome of the people who did in the Montgomery boycott, which is so active this week, they didn't know what the outcome was going to be. Nobody had guaranteed that that was going to succeed. They had to have that hope. And I think that's the greatest lesson I was given. I think both of us were given, is that we are the heirs of generations of hopeful people. My great-grandparents were enslaved in Caroline County, Virginia, and yet my great-grandfather learned to read while he was enslaved. Even though he could have lost his life, he could have been killed because it was against the law for an enslaved person to learn to read. He had a hope of freedom so powerful that he was willing to risk his life in the 1850s. He didn't know a civil war would come a decade later, but he had that skill. And my grandmother, who worked as a domestic her whole life, I tell people now, after emancipation, my great-grandfather would stand on the porch of their home and he would read the newspaper to formerly enslaved people who didn't know how to read every week. Formerly enslaved people would come over and he would stand up and read the newspaper from front to back. And my grandmother said when he started reading, she'd push her siblings aside, she'd get next to him, and she'd wrap her arms around his leg. I'd say, "Mama, why'd you do that?" She said, "I'd wrap my arm around his leg because," she said, "I wanted to learn to read too." And she said, "I thought you learned to read by touching somebody while they read." And her father said, "No, that's not how you learn to read. I'll teach you how to read." And he taught my grandmother how to read. And my grandmother, as I said, worked as a domestic, but she was a reader. She had hope that education could open things. And she made sure all of her 10 children were readers, her grandchildren. I go visit my grandmother. She'd stand on the porch, even on a cold day, with a stack of books, and you'd have to read something before she would let you
Get in the house.
into the house. And when I got to law school at Harvard, the first day they put us in this group, and everybody was asked, "Why are you in law school?" And they were all talking about how they were the son or the daughter or the grandson or the granddaughter or the nephew or the niece of the lawyer. And I started squirming because I knew I wasn't related to any lawyers. And after the 7th or 8th student invoked some family connection, I realized something I hadn't even realized until that moment. And I realized that not only was I not related to a lawyer, I realized I'd never even met a lawyer. And by the time they got to me, I felt so diminished. I didn't answer the question. I just told a joke, tried to get it. And I called my mom and said, "Mom, I don't belong in this law school." And my mom said, "What are you talking about?" She said, "You belong wherever you go." She said, "You're the smartest person in the world. You can do anything you want to do. Now you put those kids together and you tell them why you're in that law school." And I felt better after I talked to my mother, but I didn't think I could organize another student meeting. But eventually I did. And I told them, I'm in this law school because my great-grandfather was enslaved, but he had a hope of freedom. My grandmother worked poor jobs, low jobs, but she had a hope. My mother had a hope. I grew up in a poor, racially segregated community. You didn't see much hope outside the doors. People had outhouses. Not everybody worked at the poultry plants, but my mom went into debt when we were children, and she bought us the World Book Encyclopedia.
Yes.
And we had
yes.
those books in our house. And I told my classmates, I'm not related to a lawyer, never met a lawyer, but I read all about the lawyers in the books. And I tried to be honest because, when you're 10 and the Christmas comes along and you go outside and your friends are like, "Well, I got a basketball, I got a bicycle, I got a baseball." I'd have to say, "Well, I got volume G of the World Book Encyclopedia." It didn't feel that good then. But I was in that law school because I was given hope by the generations that have come before me. And I think the greatest thing we can do for your children and for the children that are coming is to give them that hope, not let them be defined by the despair and the challenges. And that's why I think we're proud to be with you because you're also giving a lot of people hope. And part of what has to happen is here we are talking to you in a space where people can learn about Mr. Hinton's story. They can learn about the work we're doing. They can know about this. That wasn't always easy or possible. It takes effort to even create this. But that does make me also very, very hopeful about what we can achieve.
Thank you for joining us. New episodes drop every Tuesday, with bonus content every Thursday. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a moment.